All right, good morning, everyone. Bobby was a tough act to follow. My presentation does not have any exciting stories or videos, so I hope you've had your coffee. Uh, all right, so my name is Chandrasekaran. I work with S&P Global Mobility, and I'm going to be talking today about the charging load that's coming out of the pretty massive electric vehicle deployment that we're envisioning happening in the near term, and what kind of impact it can have on its grid. So first, a little bit about S&P. I'll run through the going backwards for some reason. Okay, there we go. So S&P Global, it is. I do represent the S&P that you're thinking about, right? The S&P 500, Standard & Poor, the ratings organization is probably what you're most familiar with. I work in the vertical that says S&P Global Mobility on the top right there, and that one is we primarily work with the automotive industry, and we were acquired by S&P a few years ago. So a couple of years ago, we were called IHS Market, and the IHS Market was acquired by S&P, and a whole division was then created as a new vertical called S&P Global Mobility. That's who I represent. And we work with the entire automotive industry. We've been pretty entrenched with the automotive industry for a long, long time. And our main sort of what we bring to the table is providing data assets and insights coming out of the data assets. Like I said, just as exciting as fires. So we do have automotive solutions from pretty much the entire life cycle of a vehicle. Starting from forecasting and planning, so just looking ahead to what's going to be coming on the market, sales and marketing. How do dealerships target consumers effectively, things like that, and vehicles in use, which is more about how many vehicles are on the road. How do you plan for? Think about the aftermarket in the sense that if you're making tires or if you're making an alternator, how do you know how many you need to keep making to support the vehicles that are already on the road? Just real quick on our credentials, we do work with 100% of all top automakers, which is defined as 50 billion or more. We work with pretty much every medium and heavy commercial vehicle in the market. We work with 100% of all suppliers that are at 5 billion or more. We have about 1,000 data sets across energy, financial, and transportation. And we do have coverage over 70 plus countries for accurate assessments on how many vehicles are on the road and forecasting for the same. A little bit of history of, I talked about this briefly, but basically a couple of years ago, S&P Global or IHS got acquired by S&P Global, and that's where we're at. I'll skip over that. All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes, if you will. So one of the things that we're routinely asked, and I am in the consulting group of S&P Global Mobility, and one of the questions that we're often asked by utilities, by T&D companies, is what's the EV load going to look like now, and 10 years from now, 15 years from now? We talk to a lot of planning organizations, and where is that going to be? How is that going to look? What is the size of that compared to what we're dealing with today? Things like that. So to calculate the EV charging load or the hourly load shape of the EV charging load, we can really break it down into three variables, right? Vehicle miles traveled, how many EV miles are being driven that whole year, efficiency of each of those miles driven, right? So how many kilowatts did it use? All the cars together used to drive each of those miles, and the hourly charging behavior of the consumer. And that consumer could be your average EV owner at home, or a truck company or a delivery van that's running on an Amazon van that's running a BEV, right? So all of those, once you start digging into it, the number of variables keeps expanding and expanding. So if you just look at vehicle miles traveled, you're starting with vehicles in operation. So I have by zone in there now. The utility company that we did this specific project for, they wanted it by their different zones. So they want to know which zone they needed to focus on, improve their T&D to get the power to that zone where should they expect the highest EV load, right? So you need to first then figure out how many EVs are going to be bought, how many of those are going to operate in that zone, right? So how do you distribute we see a lot of forecasts at the national level for, hey, the US is going to have, 10 million, 20 million EVs on the road, but sure, where are they going to be, right? So assessing that in itself is a pretty important question to answer, right? And then you look at how many mileage each of the different types of vehicles are driving. Passenger car will have a significantly different mileage than, let's say, an electric school bus or a Class 8 truck or a delivery van. Each of those have different kind of mileages, so we need to make an assessment on what kind of mileage each vehicle is driving. And because we're looking at a 24-hour window, right, so we're looking to balance the load on 24 hours, we need to be thinking about the seasonality of driving. Are people in Michigan driving fewer miles in winter? Are people in Texas staying indoors a little bit more in July? Things like that. And then weekend and weekday split. That's another criteria, as well as traveling between the zones. So if you're going to be traveling from Houston to Dallas, like I just did, if I was driving an EV, where would I charge that, right? So how would you take the charging load that comes from my 250 miles of driving, taking that trip? Where do you apply that? Do you put it in Harris County, where I live, or do you put that load over here? So assessing those things to calculate the load on a microgeography becomes pretty challenging. And then efficiency, somewhat relatively easier, I would say. You look at the typical vehicle class. Now, one of the big data assets that S&P owns is the efficiency data for historical vehicles, as well as we do have the ability to forecast efficiency of vehicles based on the compliance metrics that all automakers have to meet, right? We do have that data set of efficiency of vehicles looking forward as well. And then finally, hourly charging behavior. Now that becomes a lot more complicated, just because we're now trying to predict user behavior. In the medium and heavy, it's a little bit more predictable, but when it comes to retail consumers, people charge how they charge. People charge when they want to, especially when everybody's used to the gasoline model, which is, I'm out of gas, go fill up. That's pretty straightforward, and we're used to it for 100 years. So how do you start predicting how they're going to behave when they start driving EVs? Especially when all the data we have is going off of early adopters. And early adopters, they do what they do. That doesn't necessarily apply to everybody else. Okay, so let me take it back a couple of steps here. One of the biggest problems in the forecasting industry has been how do you make a good assessment of electric vehicle adoption in smaller and smaller geographies, right? If you ask me how many EVs are going to be in the US today versus 10 years, 15 years, I can do a pretty good job of it, just because there's some macroeconomic factors, there's some compliance that industry needs to hit in the US for fuel economy and things like that, and you can do a pretty good job of it. But you start asking how many EVs in Texas, how many EVs in Harris County, how many EVs in 77433. Now the room for error is smaller and smaller, right? There's not a lot of positives and negatives that can cancel each other out, and you get a decent answer, right? So you need to start looking at a lot more parameters to figure out how quickly EVs are going to be adopted in smaller geographies, right? So our base level approach is to start with the national level and also start looking at some of the economic factors at the metro level, like demographics, household growth and decline. We have something called a loyalty database, which is how loyal have car owners been to the brand of vehicle that they own. Now, I used to work for Ford, and I've been driving Fords for a long time, but this is the first time in a while that I don't have any Ford products in my garage. So I've just been disloyal, if you will. And those kinds of metrics are useful in determining EV ownership as well, because interestingly, Tesla has one of the highest loyalty rates in the market. It is so high that, I mean, it's relatively new. Most people have bought at most maybe 2 Teslas, right? But it is so ridiculously high that it's just on a different scale than all the other automakers, right? So that's one of the metrics we use for assessing EV adoption rates. And if you look at a couple of other data assets that we actually have and we sell are something called household analytics and garage analytics, which is effectively looking at what households look like, what their what size of home do they have, what is the household income, and things like that, as well as what vehicles are being housed in those garage in those houses, right? A lot of the data, I mean, if you think about it, one of the funniest anecdotal pieces of data is that I used to ride motorcycles, and this was interesting to me that the biggest owners of Ducati motorcycles, the Italian sports motorcycle, are also Harley-Davidson owners, which you wouldn't put those together, but it's much more about having a unique motorcycle, right? It's instead of going and buying a Honda or a Suzuki or whatever, they sought out to buy something different, and that's how they end up with Harleys. But you can also apply that with, if you have an F-150, what are you likely to have in what's the other car you're likely to have in your garage? Is that a Ford Explorer, or is that going to be a Mustang Mach-E? Things like that allows us to predict EV ownership better than most other folks. So some of the patterns that I wanted to highlight today: EV households, they change vehicles much more frequently than gas vehicles. So 23% of the time, 23% of them change their vehicle every 2 years, as opposed to only 16% for ICE vehicles. Own 2+, almost 50% of EV owners have 2+ cars. Makes sense. You have an EV for daily driving, and if you really need to go out of town, you can take the gas car. That's only 32% for gas vehicles. The income one is always interesting. More than half of them have a household income of 100,000 plus. 70% of them are in a thriving financial profile, which is interesting to me, because if you're making 100K, you're 25, you're probably thriving. If you're 45 and you have 4 kids, 100K is probably not going to go as far. So thriving financial profile, 70%, that is, to me, the bigger indicator of your EV household profile, and a significant percent of them consider themselves to be in the prime of their life. So a lot of different factors, I should probably stay for 1 second. A lot of different factors that allow us to really drill down to smaller and smaller geographies and try to assess if these folks are going to be buying electric vehicles or not, and come up with a good. And what we effectively want from that is the charging load, or light duty average charging load, right? So this is a chart that this is a 2039 EV charging load. So step 1 was to find the vehicles, figure out how many vehicles are going to be bought by year, by location, and then you get to how much they're driving. Again, that's a data set we already have, so that's really convenient. And then combining all those with charging behaviors, right? So for light duty, so primarily retail consumers of vehicles, we broke it down into a few different types of charging profiles, like the way people might charge. So the first one is median. This is the tea kettle problem from UK that Paresh was talking about earlier. These are people who go home from work, plug it in right away at probably the worst time possible to plug in a vehicle at about 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, whenever they get home. The second is time of use, but as soon as possible. So this is plug in your car, and as soon as the time of use rate goes down, they want to charge as quickly as possible. They're primarily going to be charging late night to midnight. So think, 9 p.m. to 12 p.m. So the average VMT, vehicle miles traveled, for the US is about 40 to 50 miles, depending on where you are. So in theory, when you drive your EV home, if you're one of the 80% of new car buyers who owns a garage and can have access to home charging, you drive 30 or 40 miles, you get home, you can plug your vehicle in, you've lost only very little of your battery charge, right? People think of EV charging as, oh my God, I need to charge for hours and hours and hours, and level 2 is not going to cut it. That's somewhat true if you're trying to drive cross country or even across the strait, but on most days, when you get home from work, you've lost maybe 20%, 30% of your charge. Even at level 2, even at 7.5 or 15 kilowatt of charging, you're only looking at a few hours of charging. So the second use case, time of use as soon as possible, is people who don't want to spend the money, but they also want to charge their vehicle as soon as possible. And then you have time of use as late as possible, which is, I don't want to charge in the peak, I don't want to charge even in one rung lower. I will wait until the time that I'm going to leave. I want the charger to get to 100% by 6 in the morning. So these folks are much later in the night. It might be 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. or so. This is kind of like what my phone does right now. I plug it in, 3 o'clock I wake up, it's like I haven't even started charging yet. I'll be done by 5, don't worry about it. But right now I'm not. It's not even charging. So that's the time of use as late as possible. And then you have the next two categories, work and public charging, as well as ride hailing. These are people who are not using at-home chargers, so they're much more at risk for having to plug in for extended periods of time. They have to make use of whatever charger is available at whatever time it's available, or use fast charging, right? So both of those typically middle of the day, which again, depending on the state you live in, might be good or bad. We hear a lot about California duck curve, where you have a ton of solar in the middle of the day and there's really nowhere to put it. So EVs can help with balancing the load during the middle of the day if you can get a bit more charging in there. So putting all that together, you can come up with a total BMT for, this was specifically for PJM territories, by the way, you get to EV BMT that's in the 22 millions, right? And this is 22 million EVs and PHEVs, so plug-in hybrids that are going to be on the road for PJM territory, and then the vehicle miles traveled for those are several hundred million on the right. I'm running out of time here, so I better go through this quick. And then you can, because of all the things that I've discussed so far, we are able to split the number of EVs, the BMT, and therefore the EV charging load into the different zones that we're talking about. And this is the distribution that the client wanted for this particular time, but we do have the capability of going even lower if that's what you're looking for. But you can start seeing, if you're this utility company, you can start figuring out how you want to plan your T&D, right? There's large swaths of land here in the middle where there's not a lot of people, not a lot of EVs, and Chicago, DC area is where your higher load is going to be for light duty EV charging load. And then the same thing for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So basically, again, this is a more significant problem because there's different types of vehicles. They're going to have completely different charging profiles. But we did estimate the number of vehicles as well as the BMT for each of those types of vehicles. And as you can see, the BMT, the per day BMT for medium and heavy vehicles can be significantly different, starting from delivery vans, which do about 30 miles a day. A lot of start-stop. It might be 8 hours of driving, but they're still driving only 30 or 40 miles, all the way down to long-haul trucks, which can do about 265 miles per day. So we really need to be careful about how we plan the charging for these vehicles and the charging load coming from there. Now, you already noticed the difference. Before, you really had two hotspots for the light duty vehicles, but when you look at the heavy duty and medium duty vehicles, the charge is spread much more significantly because there's a lot more travel a routine travel, I would say, across zone borders. All right, 1 second left. Final takeaway. I got a few takeaways. First off, the total charging load from EVs is growing somewhat predictably, right? So for the territories that we were looking at, starting from about 0.5% of the total load today to about 10% of total load by 2039, right? The EV load grows about 50x from today to 2039. So in the 15-year time period, it grows 50 times the current load. And compare that to the total load is only growing 1.4 times, right? So the biggest growth is coming from EVs, even though it's only about 10% of the total load. Right? So the question in my mind is that we need to move from how much is the total load to where is the load coming from, right? Because 10% seems like it is the biggest grower. 10% is a pretty significant number, but when you look at the rate of increase sort of nationally or even on a utility level, it's not something that generation companies haven't seen before, right? It's something that they can handle, but what we need to be thinking about is where is that load coming from? Because we don't want to move the grid or improve the grid in places where the EV load is going to be less, but then ignore the places where it might be high. So T&D companies need to be paying more attention, even more attention, I would say, than the generation companies themselves. So that's my slide. Any other questions or any questions, Tom?
Great presentation. What's your impression of the new FREE roadmap tool to show exactly what you're talking about? Break it down into smaller and smaller hex areas down to about a quarter square mile.
I'm not familiar with their priest tool, so I'll reserve comment on it. And I'm not sure if that's my place, regardless.
Useful.
Good.
I have 2 questions.
Yep.
Number one, with the data set for the comparison on the brand
Loyalty?
thank you.
Yep.
With Tesla, a lot of their stuff initially was that you could only buy Tesla products. Did you factor that in initially into your comparison?
Yeah, no, I think, so one thing that we didn't really have time to get into today, but we do differentiate EV loyalty and Tesla loyalty, right? And for fact of the matter is, for a long time, those two have been the same. And in all fairness, I think we're seeing, with the early adopters especially, a very high level of EV loyalty, and they really haven't had a play anywhere else to go. So you're kind of stuck with Tesla. So that gives you extremely high Tesla loyalty. But I think what we're really seeing is EV loyalty, which should sort of play itself out, and Tesla coming at least closer towards all the other manufacturers in sort of the medium term, right? That's the expectation, although we don't have the data for that yet, right? It's starting to happen. We don't know where the bottom is, right?
My second question was, with the home charging networks and stuff like that that are going to be coming out or that are a little bit more affordable now, wouldn't it be, or is it plausible or possibly now to put in systems that are more smart capable, that people can go home, plug in their car, forget about it, and then a smart charging system turn on during those off-peak hours so that they
do that today.
Like,
they do that today.
They do that today. So,
yeah, it's programmable.
So, yeah, so
they are.
Yes,
they're very much programmable. Both on there's some charging companies that are coming out with that, but the EV manufacturers are also able to control that. That's why I use the iPhone example. The iPhone's been doing that for, I don't know if Android phones have been doing that also, but phones have been doing that for many years already, right? So it's not particularly new. I think it's much more about the financial incentives for doing it. So time of use is starting to be rolled out. in multiple utility regions. Once that's more fully rolled out and incentivized properly, the technology for using the time of use rates is already in place, right? So I don't see that as a hurdle.
Maybe not well known or well utilized.
It's not, because nobody's getting enough of an advantage in doing that, and some people also just like, okay, I'll get home, I won't plug in right away, I'll plug in later, right? The old school time of use. But I think that's, again, technology is not going to hinder that, right? Or we're not waiting on the technology, we're waiting on time of use rates. Any other questions? Thank you very much.